Shalom and welcome to the Theoria channel, where we look at the ancient manuscripts of the Bible and then ask the question, what was it that those who composed this literature were actually trying to communicate? Here is a fragment of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is a piece of a copy of the biblical book of Deuteronomy, and it contains a little bit of the verse that we're going to look at in this video. Here we read, Levavo poneh ha-yaom meyim Yahweh Eloheinu. His heart turning away this day from Yahweh our God. And here we see Rosh La'ana, poison and wormwood. Here is the same passage in the Aleppo Codex. It's not as old as the previous manuscript, but as you can see, it's more complete and easier to read. So let's see if we can work out what it was that the author of this text was actually trying to say to their readers. But before we go any further with a translation, let's begin with some context. There are a few data points about the book of Deuteronomy that we can have some degree of confidence in, and use as a starting point to understand where Deuteronomy fits into the history of Israel. First, since it appears that the books of Exodus and Numbers were likely the source material used for the composition of Deuteronomy, naturally Deuteronomy was written after. And there are references to the destruction of the nation of Israel in the past tense, so likely written at least after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. And since the books of the Deuteronomic history and some of the later prophets are largely dependent upon the book, the latest that the book of Deuteronomy could reasonably have been written was at or just after 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. The most prevalent theory among biblical scholars has been that perhaps refugees from the northern kingdom fled to the south just before or after the Assyrian Empire destroyed the nation. And during a time of religious revival and reform, they composed the book of Deuteronomy as a kind of warning. A warning saying, here is the covenant, and breaking it has these consequences. Now, there are two obvious historical situations that would fit this scenario. First is the religious reforms of Hezekiah, king of Judah, or the more popular and traditional view that it was during the reforms of King Josiah. In either case, what is relevant for us here is that the book was written to address the concerns of how to avoid what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel happening to Judah. The book of Deuteronomy is written from the point of view of a third-person narrator, albeit most of the content is Moses speaking or Moses speaking on behalf of Yahweh. The setting is Moses addressing the people of Israel just before they entered the Promised Land, and he's reminding them of the details of the covenant that they made with Yahweh at Horeb. Even though the content of Deuteronomy is a reiteration of the content of Exodus, the big difference is the way the content is structured. Whereas Exodus is a narrative, the author of Deuteronomy organized the content in the form of what is called a Suzerain-vassal treaty. We have many examples of these kinds of treaties from the ancient Near East, mostly Hittite and Neo-Assyrian. The basic idea of these documents is that they establish the relationship between a conquering empire, the suzerain, and the conquered kingdom that is being assimilated into the empire, the vassal state. These treaties have some basic elements to them. There's the preamble, where the parties signing the treaty are identified, the historical prologue, which is the story of the events that led up to the creation of this treaty. Then there's the stipulations, which is a description of what allegiance to the suzerain entails, and what's expected of both the suzerain and the vassal. And then there's a list of blessings and curses. These are the consequences for both loyalty and rebellion. Then there's witnesses. This involves listing all those present to witness the treaty, as well as swearing oaths to various deities. And then there's the arrangement for succession. This is a plan for the future relationship of the suzerain and the vassal. And we see all of these elements present in the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. So the author is taking the covenant between Yahweh and the people of Israel, as it is laid out in the book of Exodus, and condensing it down and presenting it in this format. The section of the book that we're interested in here is positioned just after the end of the list of blessings and curses. This section is essentially a warning, an instruction to the reader on how to avoid all of the curses listed above. This warning was crafted specifically for those readers contemporary to the author. And how the author does this is actually rather clever. The section starts with Moses addressing the Israelites in the reader's distant past. And as Moses' speech progresses, it shifts to the voice of the narrator and addresses the contemporary issue of the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. The author makes this transition seamlessly. It makes the reader feel like Moses is speaking directly to them. So the author is borrowing the gravitas of the character of Moses to point to the apostasy and subsequent destruction of Israel, as an example of how all these curses will come about on those who choose that path. And to help us get a gist of this whole section, just for context, I'm going to read it in a paraphrase. I am not making this covenant and its oath with you alone. I am making it with you who are standing here today in the presence of God, your God, yes, but also with those who are not here today. You know the conditions in which we lived in Egypt and how we crisscrossed through the nations in our travels. You got an eyeful of their obscenities, their wood and stone, silver, and gold junk gods. Don't let down your guard, lest even now, today, someone, man or woman, clan or tribe, gets sidetracked from God, our God, and gets involved with the no-gods of the nations. Lest some poisonous weed sprout up and spread among you, a person who hears the words of the covenant oath but exempts himself, thinking, I'll live just the way I please, thank you, and ends up ruining life for everyone. God won't let him off the hook. God's anger and jealousy will erupt like a volcano against that person. The curses written in this book will bury him. God will delete his name from the records. God will separate him out from all the tribes of Israel for special punishment, according to all the curses of the covenant written in this book of Revelation. The next generation, your children who come after you, and the foreigner who comes from a far country, will be appalled when they see the widespread devastation, how God made this whole land sick. They'll see the fire-blackened wasteland of brimstone and salt flats, nothing planted, nothing growing, not so much as a blade of grass anywhere, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which God overthrew with fiery rage. All the nations will ask, why did God do this to this country? What on earth could have made him this angry? Your children will answer, because they abandoned the covenant of the God of their ancestors that he made with them after he got them out of Egypt. They went off and worshipped other gods, submitted to gods they'd never heard of before, gods they had no business dealing with. So God's anger erupted against that land, and all the curses written in this book came down on it. God, furiously angry, pulled them, roots and all, out of the land and dumped them in another country, as you can see. God, our God, will take care of all the hidden things, but the revealed things are our business. It's up to us and our children to attend to all the terms in this revelation. Now, returning to our passage as it appears in the Aleppo Codex, the two phrases that make up verse 17, along with verse 18, are all in apposition with each other, meaning that they are grammatically parallel and have the same referent. So what we have is three descriptions of the same thing. So we have this person described as one who turns away from Yahweh to serve the gods of the nations, and they're also described as one who says in the heart, I shall be safe though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. And here in the last phrase of verse 17, we have this person described with a metaphor. En yesh bekam shoresh hore rosh w la'ana. Pen is the preposition lest, and yesh is being. So lest there be. And this construction actually indicates a warning. So beware lest there be. Beh is the preposition in or with, and chem is the second person plural pronoun, so among you. Shoresh means root, almost always used figuratively to mean something that is at the foundation or a thing from which other things grow out of, so a source or cause of something. Poreh is the verb to bear fruit, and it is a participle, meaning that it describes an ongoing action, so producing. Now the two words here are what is called a hendiadys. A hendiadys is an expression of a single idea, made with two words connected with and. We do this all the time in English. Rosh means poison or venom. It can be either the poison like that of a creature, such as a snake, or it can be a poisonous plant. We actually see it used both ways in Deuteronomy 32. W is the conjunction and then we have la'ana, which literally refers to the plant wormwood, which is a bitter herb often used to flavor alcohol. Although in the mind of an ancient Israelite, something with a bitter taste was thought of as poisonous. So this word can be translated either as bitter or poison. So the metaphor here is either a poisonous weed or a venomous snake. Since the noun is root and the verb is to bear fruit, translating this meaning a poisonous plant seems like a safe bet. But there is Isaiah 14:29 in which you have both of these words used in reference to a serpent. So let's not rule out that this passage may be referring to a venomous snake as the metaphor. We should also consider that it may be intentionally ambiguous, thus making it appropriate to translate this with more general terminology. So something like, "Beware lest there be among you a source of poison." The poison here is the attitude described in the following verse. That is, the person that has convinced themselves that they are still one of God's people, even though they are unfaithful. These are the people who know Yahweh wants them to be His people exclusively, yet they still serve other gods. Then on top of that, they convince themselves that Yahweh is fine with it. They are taking advantage of God's grace and patience, and making a mockery of it. And as we read in the following verses, it does not end well for them. So the author of Deuteronomy is warning the people of Judah to watch out for such people, because they are like a source of poison. And given the description of what follows from having such people among them, the author seems to be pointing out that when this attitude is present among the people, that this is the first domino to fall, that eventually ends up with the nation being a smoldering pile of ruins, and the people being uprooted from the land. We know from history and the rest of the biblical literature that this warning was not heeded, and Judah suffered the same fate as the nation of Israel. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem was reduced to a pile of rubble, and the nation was absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. Now, of course, neither you or I are living in the ancient nation of Judah. So what can we learn from this passage? So whatever that is that's in human nature that leads to the attitude of believing that one can be God's faithful people, but at the same time, willingly and knowingly acting unfaithfully, is still at work in people today. In fact, this very passage is quoted in the New Testament in Hebrews 12:15, and there the author of Hebrews is warning Christians about people who have fallen outside of God's grace and are causing trouble in the church. So this attitude and these people are still around today. Just to give a rather extreme example, I once met someone that did not believe that Jesus was divine or rose from the dead. In fact, this person believed that some of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels were wrong. They literally believed that Jesus was incorrect in what he taught, yet they still thought of themselves as a Christian, and even insisted that others refer to them as one as well. And of course, their lifestyle was rather contrary to anything Jesus taught. The psychological damage that is caused by living with that much cognitive dissonance must be tremendous. It makes one wonder, what's the point? Why do it? Why desire to call yourself a follower of Christ at that point? The Christian idea of God's grace is that it allows us to strive to be loyal to God, in spite of our shortcomings and failures. So it frees us from guilt. But willingly and knowingly acting in opposition to God is something else entirely. The question for your contemplation is this. When you come across an expression of this attitude, like one may come across a poisonous snake or plant, how do you keep yourself from being infected with its poison?